So Aristotle, you mentioned. What do I'd say the conventional view of Aristotle, of course, is he writes these treatises. They're not like dialogues. Somehow he had a different way of solving this problem of writing than Plato, which was to give people more of these doctrines. But I think your book cuts against that.
I think so. I'm already beginning to retreat after a few years from my radical view. But so biographically, I had a sabbatical at one point, and I was at the New School. I was in New York, and I had a chance to teach they wanted me to teach the ethics, and I was supposed to teach something completely different. I don't know what it was going to be in the spring semester. And that was the first time I had never been that interested in Aristotle. I loved reading these Platonic dialogues. I thought Aristotle was more dry and abstract.
Right.
But anyway, I had very good students and colleagues, and I started going much more slowly and realizing, oh my God, this is so complicated. This is so much more interesting than I realized. And then I probably lost a potential job at the New School years ago because I decided I'm not teaching that other course, whatever it is. I'm going to just do I got to book 5 of the ethics first semester and did books 6 through 10 the second semester.
That's good.
So going that slowly and seeing things. And I can tell you, it's very vivid in my mind what first made me see what was going on. And this is why I brought up or related to Plato's cave. Aristotle says in the beginning of the Ethics, everyone knows this, that this is not a book for everyone. You need to have the gentleman. People have to already be morally habituated. I can't be doing moral, habituation here. And then he puts it this way. If you've been well brought up and you have the that, that's a literal translation. If you have the that, you don't need the why. And everybody accepts this, it seems, right? That if you have the moral, and it's about the that would be the beautiful and the just. If you've been properly brought up and you've been habituated and you know what's noble and what's just, now you can, read my book. But then he goes, if you have the that, you don't need the why. You have to have the that in order to ask the why, but if you have the that, you don't need the why.
Right.
And I thought, oh my God, wait a minute, this is a book for no one. If you don't have this background and this kind of, training,
you shoun't read it.
You shouldn't read it. And if you have it, you don't need to read it. So I started rethinking, what is he doing here? And I also put that together with, he says it's not a book for the young. Right. Everyone likes to cite that, right? And I'm thinking, it's not for children, but that can't be right. Who would be the audience for a book like this? And if I can make a little interpolation.
That's a good point, because everyone takes that as a sort of
standard,
straightforward statement by Aristotle. When you think about it for 2 minutes, it seems a little dubious.
It's wrong. Right. You know what gave it away to me? Just a little bit of an interpolation here. There's a similar line in Maimonides, and he goes, this divine science is so dangerous and stuff, and it can't be for the young. It's only when the flame of perplexity is extinguished. And, that's where I got the reading back to Aristotle. I'm going, wait, you don't need a guide of the perplexed when the flame of perplexity is extinguished.
Right.
And then there's a similar thing in Plato's laws, that they can examine the laws because they're old men, and the Cretan law is that you can't criticize the laws with the youth.
Right.
So there's some kind of, dialogue going on here that you have to see through it, I think. So my conclusion, which I think is very commonsensical, but back to Aristotle, was the only thing this can be is someone who isn't satisfied with the that of their moral education and is seeking the why. And I call this Aristotle a guide of the perplexed,
right,
paying homage to where I understood this point from. And that's got to be what the book is for. But then I kind of moved to a more radical
So that it is a philosophic book, not just...
it's right, and otherwise, what function could it have? And I kind of pushed it a little more radically, that he can't just be passively waiting for someone, maybe. I don't think a masterful writer would just be passively waiting for someone who's beginning to be perplexed. I think he's trying to create the perplexities, right, which will make someone seek the why.
Right.
And now that's a thin line because of what we said about the orphan, right? It's very dangerous.
Right.
And so, should I go on a little bit?
But maybe Aristotle writes it in such a way that it's not as dangerous, since 98% of readers are presumably sail right along and are satisfied with these virtues are very nice, and
Yeah,
this is a
exactly.
good account of the virtues. And
I'm at such a level I can't really believe that that's true, but I know
the people,
it is true.
well, look at history. Yeah,
Look at
how many
history
people?
and look at our own people with some of our own training who maybe, I don't know, read Plato differently, but don't read Aristotle. So, I mean, one way I came to put it, so I'm sure in some sense I probably, to correct a certain tradition about how distinct Plato and Aristotle are, I think now I see better where I might have shown where they differ. Maybe we want to come back to that. But I think that one way I had of putting it, not fully satisfactory, but I think it's kind of simple, is he is occupied, in the moral virtue discussion, he's occupying two perspectives at once. On the one hand, he might be doing more than Plato does or Socrates does in showing you what moral virtue is like from the inside, how the moral man sees himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the best sign of that is moral virtue aims at the beautiful or noble. That he says that's the telos of virtue. And that cannot be subordinated to any other end. It can't be for the good.
You're right.
It's the noble, and that's the end. So I think that's how that's the self-understanding of moral virtue that Aristotle really represents and spells out in great detail in each of the different virtues. But the beginning of the book, for example, was all human beings were aiming at the good. All
Right.
human action. So how does that, right? That doesn't go together. And another problem is you can't have the virtues without this habituation of the passions. So I started focusing on these gaps or contradictions or discrepancies in the text. And, again, my simple way of putting it is that he's showing you moral virtue from the inside, maybe more in detail and more than Plato ever does, but he's also standing back and looking at it from the outside in a certain way more explicitly than Plato.
Right.
Really, looking at what does moral virtue serve, what social
Right.
value does it serve, what instrument. This one question is just whether it's a final end or instrumental already captures all that.
Right.
And then the other thing I try to do, the scholarship doesn't think Aristotle's ethic, for the most part, it's not regarded as a carefully composed treatise, right? A unitary treatise. And I don't know, you never have the exact same confidence that every word is where, like in Plato, that every word is where it is. But I do think I was on the right track, that there's the whole account of moral virtue is completed by Book 6 of the Ethics.
Mm-hmm.
And he then has these two topics or basically, pleasure and nature and friendship.
Right.
And then the conclusion about the theoretical life. I want to say that he comes to a certain reconciliation with Socrates. He's worked his way he starts out as a debate with Socrates.
Right.
And he's worked his way to a Socratic reconciliation. And then you've got these interesting phase. Again, a lot of people don't get to those late books of the ethics. It's a long book when they're teaching,
Right.
Everyone sticks with moral virtue. But it's pretty radical account of nature, pleasure. I think he comes extremely close to arguing, or he gives a very strong argument that pleasure is the good.
Yeah.
There are problems that he raises, but it's very shockingly close. And then this extremely interesting discussion of friendship, in the end. But can I add one last thing to this?
Please.
Yeah, I think the kind of gist of my book in the end is you then get this, in Book 10 of the Ethics, you suddenly get this thesis that the one good life is the theoretical life, or the life of contemplation.
Right.
And the practical life or the political life is inferior. So here's my thing, sort of simplified. The speeches of the ethics operate with a dichotomy between the political life and the theoretical life, or the practical life and the theoretical life. And that dichotomy, this is how I experienced it studying the book carefully, does not fit what you're doing.
Right.
What you've been doing in the book is examining opinions, in particular the opinions of political society about the noble and the just, what is good, what's the good life. Those are not theoretical questions divorced from practice, right?
Right.
So I try to make the argument in the book that there's and here's one other sign of this, philosophy, what happened to philosophy, right? At the end, this theoretical life doesn't sound like philosophy.
Right.
It's wisdom or something like that. So I'm trying to show how you've got these two extremes pulled apart, this life of contemplation aiming at wisdom and this political life that doesn't have a place in the speeches for philosophy, which you've been doing indeed.
Aristotle, yeah, it's making you do or showing you how to do or leading you to do.
And correcting these speeches. And he himself says when he introduces the theoretical life, he goes, oh, this was the clue. If I can add one more point to this.
Yeah.
His clue was, he says, I've been telling you all along, don't just listen to what a man says. Look at what he does. Which we all would take, right, as a very good advice. And then he says, now I'm going to finally give you my proof for the theoretical life being the best. And the proof goes like this. It's completely insane. He says, if there are God, not he doesn't even say if, the gods would honor whoever is most like themselves, and that must be the theoretical life, so that's the best life. What? There were no gods in the whole ethics until...
Right.
So obviously he's told you need a deed to support the speeches. Any kind of thesis needs a deed to support it. He's appealed to the most, and he says it's commonly believed. So he tells you this is a common opinion.
Right.
He hasn't told you what the deed is. But when you think about what you're doing, you understand, I think, his teaching. And in a way, this can get me in trouble too with a lot of my friends, some of your friends. In a way, I think the conclusion is very radical, and I would trace it back, Socrates' famous line in the Apology, the unexamined life is not worth living. It sounds kind of nice, right?
Right.
Think about things but when you take it very strictly, what he's saying is nobody else's life is worth living.
Right.
It's a very extreme
Harsh.
claim.
Yeah.
And I think that's something like what Aristotle is. He looks a little more moderate.
Right.
Because he goes, the political life is secondary happiness.
Right.
But everything in the argument has led to this Socratic conclusion. I think so that was my question in my book. There's a more Socratic way of proceeding in the ethics and a more Socratic conclusion than I think is commonly seen.
No, that's terrific.
If that makes sense.
Yes, and I think I've also had the experience of just when I was in grad school, at least reading Aristotle and just not really seeing what was interesting about it. It's very impressive. But, but then with Mansfield, a little bit of the politics and book 3 of politics, I got a glimpse of there was much more going on of a kind of dialogic, if that's the right word, sort. But your book really brings it out.
One of my big problems is, one of the big clues I got to everything was practically every line of the ethics I can trace back. Actually, what I was going to do when I despaired, I can't write this book, it's too hard, it's like too big. I was just going to make 2 lists of all the lines in the ethics and where they were coming from in a Platonic dialogue. Like this whole pleasure, I won't go into this is way too crazy, but Plato's Philebus is about pleasure is the good, an argument whether pleasure is the good. It's amazing how much of the ethics is responding and alluding and almost paraphrasing arguments from the Philebus, which is a notoriously difficult Platonic dialogue.
So it's all written with an eye towards being read in the light of Plato.
Everything, like
and
every
Socrates.
line, and I would keep changing my mind. The dialogue behind the ethics is the Republic. I even thought that the 10 books of the Republic might be his model for the 10 books of the ethics. The dialogue behind the ethics is the Meno. It's certainly each of the virtues easy. The argument about the courage is coming from Plato's law case. We could say more about that, but we won't go into it.
Which is the dialogue on courage.
On
right?
courage.
Right.
Same thing with so everything is coming from Plato, and it's so much fun. That's what I meant by dialogue.
Right.
Like when you go back and forth, it helped me. Here's what I would sort of biographically, or maybe for students or something. Plato is so much, each dialogue is such a world unto itself. And if you're someone who thinks like textually the way I do, it's so hard to stand back and
Right.
say anything of a more general import. The only way I got to do that was moving on to Aristotle and moving back and forth between the two thinkers and following the dialogue between them sort of forces you, right, to think about, well, what can I now say about courage, right, apart. So I didn't know what to title the book because he has an explicit exchange with Socrates.
Aristotle.
Yes, and what I noticed, this made me think maybe he did write it carefully. There are like 7 references to Socrates in the middle of the Ethics,
Right.
from books like, 2 to 6, and then all references to Plato, and it so happens to philosophy, are outside of that frame.
it's-
No references to Plato or philosophy within there. So he's doing something with Plato versus Socrates.
Right.
And then I got so confused I still don't feel satisfied, what the title should be. Aristotle's dialogue with Socrates was important because it's really about Socratic philosophy.
Right.
And he's explicit about his debate with Socrates that I'm trying to show he overcomes, in the course of the treatment. But in a certain way, I really meant the esoteric teaching is Aristotle's dialogue with Plato, because and I tried to fudge it by saying Plato-Socrates is the same as the Socratic Plato,
Right.
in some extent. But yeah, it's with the Platonic dialogues.
Right.
He's so steeped and he's responding and everything. And I think that you get the excitement of reading Aristotle by realizing what he's picking up from a Platonic dialogue. And you do get a certain clarity and aid in understanding
In Plato.
Plato's argument from Aristotle. So that only took me about 35 years to
No, but
come to.
that was well worth it. That was terrific.